Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Children and Young People's Select Committee today. My name is Councillor Louise Brown, and I'm chairing the meeting in the absence of the Chair, Councillor Tudor Thomas, who unfortunately is not too well today. Could we start with apologies for absence, please, Hazel?
Yes, Chair, we only have apologies from the Chair.
Okay, thank you. The next one is declarations of interest. Has anybody got any declarations of interest? Presumably not. Well, we can do it as and when. And the next item is a public open forum. I don't think we've got anybody here from the public, have we?
No, Chair, we don't.
No. So if we go on to the first report, which is delivering excellence in family services, from Family Support Services. It's on page 1 of the agenda. And if I can go to the report presenter, if you could introduce yourself. I think it's Charlotte Jury, is it? And I think you're the service manager for wellbeing, is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Are you going through the report then? Yeah.
Yes, I've got a presentation which takes people through the kind of key points of the report. I'm more than happy for people to heckle if they would like to and ask questions throughout, or take questions at the end.
It's probably easier if we take questions at the end, unless somebody's got a burning desire to ask something as we're going along, if that's okay by the committee. So over to you then, Charlotte.
Okay, let me just share this. Can everybody see that?
Yep, that's there, Charlotte. Yeah.
Okay, so these are the services I'm going to be talking through today, and what you can see on the screen in front of you are the kind of principles on which the services are based. So the overarching concept is it takes a village to raise a child, and Monmouthshire is, it's a small local authority. It's actually a big village in lots of ways, and that's a really important kind of foundational principle for all of the services that sit both within my specific service area and the services that we are interconnected with. And I'm going to talk a bit about each of those, so I won't dwell on that slide. I'm going to start with the Early Help Panel. When I first came into Monmouthshire nearly 5 years ago now, I was told, oh, we don't get any money from Welsh Government, and we don't have any, we really don't have very many services here. And as part of my induction, I spoke to people in children, young people, in education, in Flying Start, in the community, and I realised that actually what we do have is quite a lot of community cohesion. What we do have is a real willingness in order to improve outcomes for children, young people and their families, and lots of energy, really. So it wasn't that there wasn't anything, it was nothing was joined together. So I pulled together a group of people, anybody I could find that could do something useful in relation to providing services for children and young people. And I asked them if they were interested in creating an early help panel. So that would be Families First, Flying Start, Health were keen to have a forum that they could route their primary care mental health referrals, and we hadn't been using that primary care mental health services particularly well up to that point, because we didn't have a panel, a multi-agency panel that those referrals could be routed through. That was part of a pilot that was taking place between Newport and Monmouthshire at that point, but Monmouthshire really hadn't got started on it, so it was a bit of a wasted opportunity at that point. And what I found was real willingness of everybody to come around that table and with a with a keenness to make sure that families get the right service at the right time, and to help people at the earliest possible point. And so that was the birth of the Early Help Panel. And it works to a no bounce principle. So very often families can feel that they are referred on, that they're bounced around the system, and that people aren't really listening to what they want and they need. And what we've tried to do with the Early Help Panel is to hold that messiness away from families, so they don't see the kind of conversations about, you know, who would best help the family. What they get is an immediate response saying, you know, we will be dealing with your referral on this date, and then another response saying this is a service that's been your referral has been allocated to. It operated right through COVID, unlike in other areas where they stopped their panels for a period of time, because what then happened was health decided that this was a really good idea and it was working really well, and they've invested some money from health to provide some coordination and business support. And so across Gwent now we have Space Wellbeing. So SPACE stands for single point of access for children's emotional well-being. We already had the Early Help Panel and I didn't really feel that SPACE meant very much to people, so we've kept our name, but they operate now right across Gwent. In other areas, when COVID hit, some of those panels stopped operating for a number of weeks. We didn't. We went straight into operating virtually, and I think that's again one of the ways that Monmouth Show has been slightly ahead of the game, because we were already very used to operating agilely. So this is just a slide that shows the referrals to Early Help Panel, and they are coming in thick and fast. They're coming in thick and fast across Gwent. We have proportionately more referrals than other areas in Gwent. And in the last quarter, we had the highest number of referrals that we have ever had to Early Help Panel. It will come as no surprise to people, I don't think, that the demand is increasing. One of the things that we did when COVID hit was to try and put investment, because we had lots of people who couldn't go out and do direct work with families. We redeployed those people to operating an advice line, doing virtual sessions, and offering support and advice at the very earliest level. So we established the advice line. We carried on the advice line in a slightly different format, because it's added real value. And so what we have is one call handler, and what she's able to do is take a lot of, we get consistently relatively high numbers of calls for a very small service. And what we can do is we can offer callbacks to more specialised services. So if it's a parent who's very anxious about their child, then we can either pick up a referral into Early Help Panel, we can offer a callback with a school-based counsellor or a family therapist or a family support worker. We can help with inquiries around CAMS and SCAMS, because we get lots of people being very anxious about their children's emotional well-being. And we can also send out resource packs. So that's been a really valuable early resource, and we are currently looking at how we make that more sustainable. Building Strong Families is a central pillar of our early intervention offer. It's a very small team that works with families who want support but don't need a social worker. So the involvement is voluntary, and it's generally around parenting or self-confidence, self-esteem, resilience, and behavioural issues at an early level. We get lots of referrals into the service, and we have long waiting lists in every area, which then causes more pressure, because it means that we're not able to offer that support as early as we would otherwise want to. This is just a little bit of data about the outcomes in terms of Building Strong Families. So there's really high levels of satisfaction, 92.3% of families so far this year. The 20 to 20, I should say 21 to 22, I do apologise. That is part year data. What I've tried to give you is the most up-to-date data that I can, typos notwithstanding. You can see from the table in terms of referrals that 1920 we had a big increase in referrals because we had additional staff. And what we've had this year is a fairly consistent number of referrals, but what we do have is we've had some sickness within the team that COVID has impacted us. Stress and vicarious trauma has impacted this team. It's not impacted in terms of outcomes. The outcomes are really positive. The number of families escalated to children's services remains really low, which evidences that it's holding that work and stopping that flow into children's services. And we also have very low numbers of families disengaging from support, which is all good news. But I'm hoping that we can have improved sickness rates next year. We've also got some additional money come from Welsh Government as a 1 year uplift. And so we're employing 2 further workers into that team on a 1 year contract, which should give some additional capacity. Monmouthshire Young Carers, there isn't any data on this slide because we haven't had them for a full year. But this is just a quick slide to say we've got the Young Carers Service now in-house, who are working directly with some young carers. So there's a group of young carers that have access to information and advice, access to activities and other resources, and there's a smaller group of young carers that need time limited, more intensive support. So that might be around advocacy at school, it might be around support with medical issues, or it might be around their own well-being and their transition and what they want their futures to look like. So there's all kinds of bits of work going on in that, and I'm hoping to be able to report some really good outcomes at the end of the year for young carers. Face-to-face creative therapists, this is a very small team of 2 part-time play therapists and 2 part-time family therapists, but they really punch above their weight in terms of the outcomes that they deliver. All of the detail of this is in the report. I'm just kind of talking you through the kind of key points. They offer support through group work as well as direct work, and the other thing that they started in, the play therapists in particular, is providing support to family support workers and helping support workers with their thinking so they can develop their skills. So they're offering a kind of higher level, more intensive service. So it's adding value right across the system. We have school-based counselling. Nathan Meredith, who's the school-based counselling team lead, has been working really hard this year on looking at ways and creative ways of really expanding capacity. What we can see here is referrals, high numbers of referrals, and there's a big gap between the number of referrals we're getting and the ability, the capacity of a small team to meet that demand. So there's a gap between the bright blue column and the sort of ochre coloured column between the referrals and the numbers seen. And you'll see in the academic year 2020 to 21, there was an increase in referrals, a lower number of children seen, and a higher number of sessions. And that's because the level of complexity had increased so much that children were needing to be seen for longer, which meant that although more sessions were offered, fewer children were seen. That gap has come down this year because Nathan's worked really hard in building partnerships with colleges to bring in placement students and volunteers to expand capacity, and he's looking really at working with communities, about working with partner agencies, offering group-based interventions to really expand the capacity and narrow the gap between the demand and supply. Achieving Change Together team, that is an intensive psychologically and systemically informed team that works with children where we have serious concerns that if things don't change quite significantly, those children will end up being looked after by the local authority with all the poor outcomes of that we see for those children. And we've got some really positive data in relation to the work of that team. Since they've were developed about 2.5 years ago, they work with families for up to 18 months, and the reason that they have that longer term intervention is because families don't get themselves into these challenging situations overnight, and therefore we can't expect those difficulties and challenges to be overcome quickly. So this is a relational, long-term, medium-term based intervention. So they've now closed completely with 23 families with 74 children. 81% of those children are still at home. Lots of children who were on the child protection register have come off the child protection. 8 families, which is 34%, have closed entirely to children's services, and most of those have been closed for over a year. So that's really positive outcomes in relation to that team. Family group conferencing and mediation services, again, very, very busy services. They're picking up a lot of challenges that will enable, and the way that it works, it really is about families taking ownership of their own difficulties and their own solutions and finding their own way through that. The mediation service has really taken off. It had a very, very slow start, but once it did start, it has really positive outcomes, and they're both really good. Very small services, but very good services. And what we were able to do with family group conferencing, originally it was delivered by Action for Children. It's a great service, we were very happy with it. But what we were able to do by bringing it into the local authority was absorb the administration and the management costs. And so we could squeeze 5 days work out of 3 days money. So we've been able to expand the service in that way. We've also been able to expand both the Achieving Change Together team and family group conferencing and mediation through ICF funding. I just wanted to use this slide to show how things join together. So what we have at the beginning of a child's journey through services is the early help panel and the support that they would have at a very early stage. It might be advice through the advice line, it might be a multi-agency meeting in the school where emerging problems or difficulties and support is looked at. We've got a kind of parallel panel in adult services, the housing intervention panel, that was based on the principles of the early help panel, because stable and secure housing is a really good organisational principle for adults and families. Then if challenges are continuing, there might be a network meeting where we bring all of the people who are involved in that child's life to a discussion to look at, well, if these things aren't working, what else do we need, and how might we adapt our offer to better meet the needs of that child and the family that sits around them. There's an interface meeting that really looks at the interface between statutory services and pre-statutory services and making sure that we have the right child in the right process. All of those are to keep as much as we can out of statutory services. There's also a neurodevelopmental panel that hold that processes all the referrals for iScan, where parents are saying, you know, I think there's something wrong with my child. I think they might need a diagnosis of ASD or ADHD. Then we've got the other routes into children's services. Then if we are not able to hold it at that level, and in some cases we aren't, there will always be a need for statutory support. That might be as a child protection investigation, or we might be looking at issuing to court, child protection registration, or that child becoming looked after or adopted. And then at the end of that road, we have children and young people coming out of the looked after system. And what's really important is all of those systems speak to each other. So children aren't falling out, or we're not losing children between the gaps. Some challenges and opportunities. So with COVID right across Wales, right across the UK, we've seen increased demand and complexity across all services. We have a wellbeing crisis with our young people at the moment that some of you will be aware of. We've got some real worries in some of the schools. And we really need to build capacity and resilience, including really working with communities to look for opportunities and grow teams, reduce waiting times, including working with volunteers and students. We've got a whole piece of work going on. Our participation strategy, the Children's Services Participation Strategy, has been highlighted by the Children's Commissioner as a model of good practice, which I was quite chuffed about because I wrote it. But there's a difference between having a piece of paper and really seeing it in action. And what we're trying to do at the moment with Children's Services is really drive forward those action plans and get that embedded within practice right across Children's Services. We're looking at group work approaches for children and families as a way of offering services to more people in an efficient way. We're promoting self-referral systems in school, particularly for school-based counselling, so children are identifying their own need, and adults aren't gatekeeping that service. We're working with schools, doing a whole bunch of work with schools around looking at emotional well-being of children, particularly as around school attendance, how that's impacted by emotional well-being, and then working with partners to develop integrated approaches to children's well-being. This has to be something that is a community approach. It can't be the responsibility of a single agency. It's not how children work. And that is me done. You're on mute, Louise.
Sorry. Yeah, I was just saying that that was an excellent presentation, and we want to thank you and all your staff for the work that you are doing. And I think the early intervention panel is an excellent idea, because obviously, you know, if you can catch problems at an earlier stage, then it prevents it escalating into something more. And it looks like the model that you presented is very clear as to the different stages and, you know, how these different agencies can intervene. I mean, obviously there is the concern, you know, with regard to COVID and that effect on mental health, and now we have the added concern about the cost of living and, you know, how families will cope with that particular aspect. I just before I throw it open to members, I just wanted to ask what sort of involvement were there with the debt referral people, you know, to make sure that families are managing their budgets to avoid the stress that can be involved there.
Well, that's one of the real values of the helpline that we set up. The helpline worker is trained to give basic welfare rights advice. That was a piece of work that Welsh Government did 2020, 2021, can't remember. But they offered training opportunity to help upskill people who might be in a position to offer advice. We also have very good links between the Early Help Panel and the Housing Intervention Panel, and the Housing Intervention Panel has lots of opportunities for people to seek advice around welfare rights and benefits advice and income maximisation and debt management and debt advice. So we have a worker that sits across both of those panels to make sure that we've got the right to join up and people are getting the right support and advice, because people will be very, very conscious. You can have a family that is managing, they have some challenges maybe, but they're holding their own, and financial pressure can then dip them into crisis.
Yeah.
And so making sure that we can offer that support is really critical.
Yeah, and the holistic multi-agency approach is great. Can I throw it to members who would like to ask any questions on the report? Councillor Powell, yeah.
Yes, thank you. It is in the chat box if you can see it for.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Ready. Sorry, just so you know, and the others are. I want to thank you so much, Charlotte, for this presentation and for all the work you do. It's invaluable, all of you that do that work. It's been such a difficult time all round. What I'm a bit concerned about, there are a certain number of children who haven't really connected with working online, or not especially because they didn't have the ability, because they probably did have laptops provided, but because they just didn't involve themselves in that, and now they still seem to be at home and not going to school. You know, I don't know how you can get round that, and whether you have any ways of encouraging them to come to school, because the trouble is, in some ways, I suppose it's the parents, they're nervous about them going in case they pick COVID up, but it's been so widespread. I think that is just is something we've got to overcome. We've got to learn to live with it. The other thing was, have the referrals been particularly because families have been confined all to one house, and sometimes when a lot of you are all confined to one place, it upsets the balance, and people get more stressed and irritable with each other. And I don't know if you found that. So thank you very much as well.
Oh, well, thank you. I really appreciate your positive comments. What I would say is I may be the front face today, but it really works as a you know, I'm at the bottom there, and all of the people across the service are the people who are actually the important people doing the stuff. And there's also something about really understanding how my bit of the world, you know, I get all the nice bits in a lot of ways, but it really fits in alongside the kind of sharp end of children's services. And one of the things I'm really proud of actually is how we managed to join those two bits together. They're not separate, they are part of the whole system. In terms of your first question, there are a number of pieces of work. So all of those services, because education is such an important part of a child's life, all of those services will be picking up, supporting children back into education, supporting children into accessing learning. There's a kind of underpinning theme of social pedagogy right the way across the landscape there. The outcomes for ACT, in terms of almost all of the children that ACT work with, improve their educational attendance as a result of engaging with ACT. Some not as well as they're still not where we hope them to be, but every single child, I think there were 3 that didn't. But apart from that, the numbers of children improving their attendance, they have, in order to benefit from school, they have to be there. So attendance is fundamental to that. In terms of the more specific stuff, there's a piece of work going on between the educational psychologists and school-based counselling around really looking about emotional-based school avoidance. And actually, if you think about it, most school avoidance is rooted in emotional well-being, children not being happy in school. If they're happy in school, they're happy to go to school. If they're not able to go to school, for whatever reason, there's going to be an element of emotional something going on there. So that's a big and kind of longish piece of work around how do we work with schools to support getting children back into learning, whatever that looks like for them. I also sit on the management committee of Monmouthshire's PRS, Pupil Referral Service, and that kind of helps me make some helpful kind of connections as well. Improving children's learning and learning outcomes is absolutely fundamental and has to be at the heart of everything we do. Having said that, it's not a quick fix. It's really challenging, and our children and young people, I think in Monmouthshire, in other local authority areas, you don't get that big difference between the children that are coming from more affluent communities and those that don't. In Monmouthshire, that difference is more visible for children, and we know that impacts on their emotional well-being. I guess all I can say is we are aware of that and we're doing our level best.
Thank you very much.
And you asked me a second question that I now can't remember.
I asked you whether the fact that the families were all confined to the house, very often the man of the house who was out working wasn't able to work, and they're all crammed in the house, whether you found that was affecting the children in tremendously or not, because I can imagine people getting on each other's nerves, and whether the children were affected by that.
I think to the degree that had an impact, I think we're largely through that now, because children are back in school, people are back in work. I think that space is always an issue. So if you have access, we know that having access to the outside, having access to green space, having access to enough space around you is really important in terms of people's well-being. So I would say both yes and no as an answer to that question.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. I think we've got Councillor Watkins who wanted to ask questions now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, Charlotte, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. You actually made a very long, complicated report much easier to understand and to follow. So really well done on that one. That was great. And Tyrone, who I know is on the call, will now be relieved that I will not be asking my standard question about are we certainly doing enough in terms of preventative, because you have really demonstrated that with the report today. So that's brilliant. Thank you very much.
There's never enough. We can never, Tyrone, we can never do too much.
No, I would agree with that. Over the years, it has been wonderful being involved, or me taking more of a personal interest in children's services, and the direction of travel now is unrecognisable to what we had 7-8 years ago. And the intervention of managers like Charlotte has been fundamental. And your useful question you asked, Councillor Watkins, is still pertinent now as it was back then. In terms of our direction of travel, it is that preventative approach. A last resort is where the local authority wants to take the parenting responsibility to take that away and bring children into care. If we can do the more downstream work, some of the work that Charlotte's doing, is other work as well wider to do that. That's certainly the trajectory we're going to carry on.
Great. Yeah,
but we also
brilliant.
need to make sure that we are making absolute best use of the resources that we have. Resources are finite. You know, I would love to be able to wave a magic wand and double the number of staff, and that's just not realistic. And I think if we are to even begin to scratch the surface in terms of demand, we're really going to have to reach into our communities and work much more closely with our communities to grow that resource and resilience there. And that's kind of my next focus, really, in how we do that.
That sounds really encouraging, and I really would love to commend the Achieving Change Together team, because those outcomes are excellent, and that's been really lovely to see that demonstrated. I have one question which I suspect is not actually going to be in your remit, because it's the Neurodevelopmental Panel aspect. And I know that anecdotally, because I'm connected in with many ALN networks, parents feel that if they don't get through that panel, if they don't then get passed on to an iScan referral, they feel lost, and then they feel like they're dropped at that point. So what can we do to support those parents who then don't get that referral to get their children diagnosed? Because sometimes I know parents can go 3 iScans before they get a diagnosis, and it can be extremely challenging for them.
They automatically, if they don't get accepted there, they automatically come into early help panel. So they're not dropped, but it can feel like they're dropped because they're not getting the answer that they want. And what the early help panel tries to do is really look at the needs of the child, the needs of the family, what we have, what's available. And that might include, you know, support around going back into the kind of iScan process.
Okay.
But it's not that there is nothing there. It's that sometimes if you're not getting the answer that you want, what the offer is, although it might be. And one of the kind of approaches that the early help panel takes is you have the child that you have, and there may be resources here that will be helpful to you to help you parent the child that you have. The label isn't going to change the child that you have, but there may be some really helpful resources here around Early Help Panel that will help you and your child in terms of the situation that you're in.
Yeah, okay. I still think more people could do with getting to iScan a bit sooner, because having been through that process, it is pretty agonizing.
Absolutely, yeah. and I wouldn't dispute that at all, but I can't, unfortunately, I'm not the gatekeeper.
No, indeed.
That bit. That would be helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
If we have Councillor Grocott, and I think Maggie Harris then seemed to want to come in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Really interesting report. A couple of questions arising from it, if I may. You'll be, excuse me, you'll be aware of Jude Langdon and her team looking at the impact of poverty in the county. My ward in Abergavenny is the one around Derry View School and that estate, where there is considerable poverty and all the stresses that then puts onto family life and the rearing of youngsters. I wonder, after 2 years of facing COVID, we are now facing a perfect storm of a cost of living crisis that already has led to me having conversations with people in my ward who say, I don't know whether to put the heating on or to feed my child today. And you know, with the current conflict going on in the world, the real fear is that the cost of fuel and so on will continue to rise almost exponentially. And this is going to be awful potentially. And we don't know what's going to be there next week. So my first question is, does your service have the flexibility to respond to changes that at the moment we might not even know are there? Who would have thought 3 months ago that there would be a major war going on within Europe? A second question really is about liaison between professionals. I was really pleased to hear you mention that you're on the management team at the PRU, and I heard you talk about education psychology. And the reality is, of course, that in bringing up young people with a range of difficulties, they're faced with meeting all sorts of different professionals, and their parents are probably even more confused than the children themselves are by this proliferation of expertise. I wonder how your service, which is clearly based within one element of the structure of the county council, works with other bits of the services provided by the county council under children and young people. Services like you mentioned Ed Sykes, but also the Gwent ethnic minority support service and a whole range of other specialist services. How do you all, as professionals focusing on children, bring your services together? And then thirdly, in my role as a councillor, I'm also a local authority governor at a school at King Henry VIII in Abergavenny. And I have a specific responsibility there for children who are in different ways regarded as vulnerable. You're clearly working hard with the professionals, but are you working just as hard with people like myself as a specialist governor of a school? Or is there more that you could be doing with governance to raise our awareness and our ability to support our schools in that governance role? And in that role, I would love to meet you or one of your staff in King Henry to talk about things like the young carers who clearly come under my remit there and who do cause me angst from time to time. Thanks very much, and well done, Charlotte, on the work you're doing.
Thank you. Well, if I could take the last point first, we can always do more. Always. And I'm more than happy to pick up and have a conversation with you and look at, and I think one of the points I was making earlier is that, yes, my next piece of work is very much about how we get more into working more closely with community-based activity and how we develop the resource in that way. One of the points I would make is that partnership working isn't about having everybody around the same table, but it is having the right people around the right tables and then the right lines of communication between those tables. And it's as people come and go, and as partnerships grow and ebb and flow, it's like trying to nail jelly to a wall. But I'm always open to people saying, oh, I think you've missed a bit here, and making those connections and actively seeking those connections. So thank you for that. In terms of liaison between the services, there's a whole range of places where that happens. So the early help panel is a key one. You get a seat at the early help panel if you can take a referral away and do something useful with it. We also work very closely with the school-based MAMs, the multi-agency meetings, and we have attendance. We have a link between the early help panel and the school-based multi-agency meetings, and that's a really valuable line of communication and liaison. Because the schools will be looking at the needs of their own individual pupils, and then we link into the early help panel where the range of services are available. And there's a membership, there's a shared membership between those two panels as well. It's not identical, but it's shared. Another piece of work that's ongoing at the moment that I'm involved in that sits in CYP is the early years transformation pioneer work, and that is around, and you may be very interested actually in asking Beth Watkins to come and talk to you about that. That's a really exciting piece of work around setting up community-based hubs that will enable every child 0 to 7 to have somebody, a professional, who is interested in them. And it's a multidisciplinary approach, and it's around really supporting at the very earliest stage family and family resilience and child welfare and child development, right pre-statutory, kind of universal. It's a bit like Flying Start on steroids, and I'm really excited about that and what the opportunities of that will bring. In terms of agile working, Monmouthshire, I think, has always been a bit all about the agile, and what that means is that as services we've been able to pivot quickly. So when we went into COVID, our school-based counselling service was already exploring a digital platform, so that happened almost immediately. We set up the advice line. The advice line went live before the end of March. So we went into lockdown, but the advice line was set up almost the following week. We adapted our offer to offer virtual, and I know virtual doesn't work for lots of families, and some families have kind of sat on the waiting list because they haven't wanted virtual engagement, but actually for some children it does work, and for some, this is a different example now, but we had to move a child from one fostering placement to another, and that was done, and that child was able to see all around the house and meet the dog and see all kinds of things that actually would have been much more difficult to do face to face. That worked really, really well. So there has been stuff that's happened because of COVID that now adds value, and we are keeping as part of a blended approach. In terms of what the future looks like, yes, I'm really, really worried. I am really, really worried for lots of our most vulnerable families. There are things that sit outside of what we're able to do. The best that we can do is to and make sure that we have the right lines of communication and can advocate for the families with whom we work as best we can. But we don't control the cost of gas, and we don't control the price rises. I am working and I've met with people like Ryan Coleman and Jude Langston. And again, it's about how do we join together some of the kind of specific services and some of that community-based work that's going on, so we can each bit can add value to each other. Does that answer your questions?
It does. Thank you so much, Charlotte. I appreciate your time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Maggie Harris, you've got a question.
Thank you, Charlotte. I want to say thank you to an amazing presentation. I'm a governor at Derry View in my sort of that side of my personal capacity, so I see the impact of what you're doing. And although we haven't been into school very much to see my interaction, because I'm the safeguarding governor, I understand what's going on and I do appreciate it. My question was around the impact of poverty and the stress and the perfect storm that Martin mentioned, and you've actually covered that, and the impact that all of this actually has on our immigrant children as well, and you've covered that too. So I won't take up any more time because you've already covered what I wanted. Thank you so much. Thank you, Louise.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I just thought of a couple of questions if committee members haven't got any others. You know, obviously during the COVID period, the school children weren't getting the same pastoral support that they did before, and I just wondered if you knew of how the schools were adapting to sort of cope with that year or two gap, you know, for pupils that hadn't necessarily had the same pastoral support that they did before. And the second question is really about, you mentioned the gap about sort of listening and support for pupils, and I just wondered, I think you mentioned about college leavers and other people being encouraged, but I mean, I think there's organisations obviously like Gavo, and I think there's a charity called Transforming Lives for Good. So I think there are possibly opportunities, but it's whether you've got the you know, capacity, I suppose, to be training people in how to do this type of support work, because obviously people would need the relevant checks and training. Is that something that is being explored as well? So there's two questions there, one on the pastoral support side, and that's probably better to ask school staff, but I just wondered if you knew anything about that, and also the second question about sort of improving the volunteer capacity with regard to the gap that was identified in your charts.
In relation to the pastoral support of pupils, I know that that pastoral care is a central pillar for all of our schools in Monmouthshire. I can't speak to that. I'm not based in CYP, so I can't speak specifically to that, except insofar as I know that the multi-agency meetings that do take place in most of the secondary schools, there's one this afternoon in Monmouth, pastoral care of pupils is paramount, and we work very closely between the MAMS and the early help panel, because a lot of the work, the different services in early help panel, so there's SHIFT, there's primary care mental health, FIT, all of those services are very much around emotional well-being and the promotion of children and family emotional well-being. I don't know if that answers that. That's the best I can do.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's not really your area, but I just wondered, yeah. So I think the second question was about improving the volunteer bases because of the gap, really, of, you know, in terms of demand and you know, listening and supporting families. I mean, obviously the volunteers have got to be able to be in a position to refer to the, you know, the experts as and when required.
And we have quite a few volunteers across our system. I think we are quite good at encouraging people to come out to play with us. We offer student placements. We're working with colleges. So we've got counselling students volunteering with us. We have social work students. We have youth work students. We have some parent volunteers, so parents who have been involved in receiving some of the service. Some of those parents are now working within the service in paid employment. So we have quite a good track record across early help services of looking for opportunities to bring people in and expand. But I absolutely think there is more potential there. And I think that if we are, as I said, if we are to even scratch the surface of demand, we really need to be looking at how we grow capacity using volunteers, using students, placements, offering placements to colleges, that kind of thing. Because there's so much skill out there. There was one psychology undergraduate student who did a student placement in BASE, which is our psychology and play therapy support for children who are looked after. She, off the back of that, then did some sessional work for me in our family time service that supports supervised family time between children who are looked after and their parents and other people who are important to them. Plus, she did some volunteer work with our Achieving Change Together team. So she ended up being a student doing work for free for us, as a volunteer doing some free work, and then doing some paid work for us as a sessional worker, which has been amazing.
Yeah, that's good, because I think sort of on a traditional basis, parents have, even on a long-term basis, have gone in to help children with reading and various other things, so I suppose the the PTAs might know of people who are willing to support that, but obviously they have to have the proper training in order to do so.
And support, what we can't do is bring people in and say off you go, go and get on with it. They need to be within a structure where they can be provided with the right support and key contacts, so they know who they can ask questions for, and we know what they're doing. So it needs to be safe. Yeah,
that's what I'm saying. Yeah, so it's got to be training and kept an eye on. But I think I'll summarise in terms of the committee. Thank you for the excellent report, and as I said at the beginning, thank you and your staff for all the work you're doing. And I do very much agree that the early intervention approach is actually the best one, because whatever you can work with families, and there are an awful lot of pressures, as the questions have said, in relation to not only COVID but now the cost of living concerns. So I think well done for the work, and I think you said that you'd set up the early help panel. Is that right? Yeah, and thank you very much for that work, and thank you for the report.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. So if we now come on to the next report, which is the budget report, is this one that you're going to lead on, Tyrone?
That's right, Councillor. I'll do the general introduction. Then I'll go into the children's element of the budget that sits within social care. And then I'll move on to my colleague, Nikki Wellington, who can then take you through the remainder of the CYP portfolio of the budget monitoring, and that's primarily schools. So happy to start whenever you're ready, Councillor. Thanks.
Yes, that's fine, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, members. If I take you to pack page 19 of your reports this morning, agenda item 5 is the 2021-22 month 9 forecast outturn report. In terms of your select portfolio, that includes the children's services element of social care that comes under my remit, and then predominantly the remainder of CYP is given through schools, and I'll hand over to Nikki Wellington because that falls under her remit. But if I do a general introduction first and then cover off the children's services social care element, if I take you to recommendation section 2 and noting in 2.1, the month 9 forecast outturn is predicting a surplus for the overall council revenue budget of just in excess of £2 million. In 2.2, that explains the reasoning for this surplus, mainly down to late last-minute grants coming in from Welsh Government in Q3. 2.3 is detailing if the surplus is derived at year end, we will look to replenish our limited one-off reserves. I think that's going to be welcomed, especially with how they've been depleted over the past decade. If I take you to note 2.7 on page 20, is just to inform members that the forecast also includes the 1 3/4% staff pay award for this financial year as well. What we've tried to do is try to put in as much cost as possible into the month 9 to give you as much of a prediction of the year-end outturn as possible. If I draw your attention to the table in note 3.4 on page 21, and that shows the Social Care and Health Directorate overall is forecasting an overspend of just £26,000. If I try and put that into context for you, the overall Social Care and Health Directorate budget is in the region of £53 million. So a £28,000 overspend is more or less a balanced budget. On the surface of it, that looks fantastic news. However, it does mask the pressures that are still there, that are part of the budget for next year that's being signed off by Council this afternoon. The position for the entire Social Care and Health Directorate has improved by £1 million since month 6. The reason for that is entirely down to last-minute Welsh Government grants. In the main, the winter pressures grant of £1.25 million. If I take you to page 23, and in terms of how that Social Care and Health Directorate relates to the CYP Select portfolio, Children's Services element of social care has a predicted overspend of 394,000, a significant improvement of over 600,000 since month 6, and this represents the Children's Services social care share of the winter pressures grant, which we're using to facilitate spends in mainly in external placements. In terms of savings, each year when we set the budget, we look at where services can make any savings and any contribution to the overall budget. For the Children's Services element within social care, there were no savings put forward for this year, so there's no savings progress to inform you of. And in terms of the capital programme, again, Children's Services have no capital schemes at the moment. In terms of questions, if you don't mind, if I leave them to the end, and then I can just pass you on to Nikki Wellington now, who can take you through the remainder of the CYP forecast.
Yeah, that's fine. So over to you, Nikki.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so in terms of Children and Young People's Directorate, we are forecasting an overspend of 1.1 million, and this is detailed on page 52 of the report. The overspend, you members will be aware, is primarily down to additional learning needs, and I'll go through the detail of that in a minute. I just want to give you an idea of the improvement, because there's been an improvement of 134,000 since month 6. So just to give you some idea of where those main movements have been in terms of the improvement. So the individual school budgets has improved by 195,000 and is actually now showing an underspend of 29,000. That relates to, there were several schools where we were awaiting outcomes of back pay that we were paying for the schools. Those have all been agreed now, and the provision that we put forward was higher than the actuals that have gone through. So we've made a saving on that. Moving on to additional learning needs, as I said before, there's been an increase in the forecast for additional learning needs by 71,000. The two main areas of overspend in that area are School Action Plus, which is the support for the pupils within our schools, and some of that funding is actually relating to pupils that are using the services of Mon Life. So we're obviously paying Mon Life for the provision of some support for those pupils there. The other area is, and this is detailed on page 56, I should have said, the other area of additional cost is that we have some additional staffing in one of our SNRB, our special needs units. And that's obviously because there's been increasing numbers of pupils in there, which is obviously saving on out-of-county provision if we had to place those children elsewhere. So happy to move on to schools then and take questions at the end. So schools is on page 57 of your reports. So the opening balances for schools was a £3.4 million surplus. That is now increased to £4.1 million. We still have two schools in a deficit, one primary, one secondary. But I will say to members that both those schools have recovery plans in place, and actually they are beating those recovery plans. They're improving above those recovery plans that are in place. So that's good. The prime reason for the movement in school balances is the amount of grants that we have received from Welsh Government in the last quarter. So we've received over £2 million worth of grants that have gone directly out to schools. So just giving you a brief detail. We had a Winter of Wellbeing grant of 117,000, support for the additional learning needs new bill, which is 184,000, the Triple R's Raise Recovery Recruit grant of 669,000, and the final grant, which is the revenue maintenance grant, so offsetting caretaking, cleaning costs, etc. like that, which was 1.1 million. So obviously we've got schools with significant surplus balances, which we will be working with schools to ensure that those grants are spent in appropriate ways, and that the grants are used to support the pupils as they should be, and the balances are brought down to a more manageable level as we move forward through the period. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. I think thank you very much for the reports, and obviously it's better to see that things, particularly on schools, are improving in terms of the balances. Are there particular grants that are most of the grants as a COVID basis, or are they for particular aspects? And what's the time limits on these grants being spent?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, in terms of the grants, there are grants for specific items that are not related to COVID. So if I go through the additional learning needs grant, which I mentioned, 184,000. Yes, that doesn't relate to COVID. That's there specifically for the new Additional Learning Needs Act that's coming in, and the revenue maintenance grant, which is 1.1 million. We've seen this we've had this for a number of years. We've seen it pre-COVID. So no, that's not related to COVID either. In terms of the grant spending, I mean, obviously any grant that we can give out to schools is very, very welcome, but obviously the timing of these grants are right at the very end of the year. So with the revenue maintenance grant, that will be spent this year and has been spent by schools because it can offset expenditure that's already existed in schools. All schools have an element of caretaking, and all schools will obviously have elements of cleaning, so we can offset that grant. we have agreed with Welsh Government that a number of the other grants can be rolled into the next financial year, to be spent in the next financial year.
Oh, that's good, yeah.
Yeah, which will allow schools obviously to plan and make proper provision for those grants rather than rush them through to spend by the 31st of March.
Okay, thank you. So if we could have a hand function in the chat bar if members want to raise any questions on the budget. Or as it's not come up yet, if you want to put your camera on, if you want to ask a question. Oh, it's there now, the raise hand in the chat bar. I think Councillor Watkins has said that she hasn't got a question. Is there any other members who've got a question they want to ask? No, I think they're obviously, you know, pleased with the reports that we've actually received, you know, because obviously the financial position is better than we were expecting, I suppose, really. So, are there any further budget reports? Because I'm having difficulty with my member section on the reports.
No, it's not, Chair. The report we presented is the full report.
Yeah.
In terms of having no questions, it must be that me and Nikki have got a nice polished double act now. It's like Laura and Hardy. Nikki's usually saying, "What is a fine mess you've got me into, Ty?" But it seems like we finally got it polished. In terms of the report, even though we're showing a favourable financial position, I don't want to dampen that down, but one-off grants have masked the real pressures moving forward. So going forward to council this afternoon, it's still a £1.3 million pressure for the children's services element within social care. That's still real. We've still got lack numbers, even though they're stable. They are still increasing by, say, 1 or 2 or 3, and those new ones that we're coming in are the ones that require the high cost, the high intense support. That's still not going away, and with these short-term grants, it just masks it. Even though it's welcomed, we need every penny, but we still can't lose sight of, even though it's favourable this year, we still are going into next year with those pressures, and still the challenge that presents us. Thanks, Chair.
Yeah, I mean, when you say in terms of the pressures on social care, I presume that's children who are in care, and perhaps the numbers of those increasing, or the complexity of their needs. Is that what you mean by that?
Not necessarily. The major pressure is the looked after population that we serve, but also going back to Charlotte's report, is where we're trying to get those finances, where we've exhausted all of the creative opportunities to make use of the scarce resources we've got. We were trying to make sure that we still bolster and have that preventative support downstream, because as I sort of interject on Charlotte's presentation, the last resort is to bring someone into care. It is that preventative support, and that does come at a cost, and as the demands, especially with cost of living, so on and so forth, and the effects of COVID, the demand on those services are greater and greater and greater. So it's trying to cover those off as well, whether we need staff in post or we need additional services to try and supplement that preventative agenda that we've got, Chair.
Yeah, and I suppose it's also when you're going for innovative approaches, looking for the appropriate grants that you can apply to supplement that work, really, isn't it?
Spot on, and also the legacy those grants leave, because when they then get retracted, we just can't turn the tap off. So then we're left in to try and carry on that work. Otherwise, it's just lost. There's no point just doing it for a short period of time where the grant's there, and then we're having to look at a longer term strategy. And sometimes, if we've exhausted all of the current resources we've got in terms of financial, we have to look to, unfortunately, put a pressure forward. But we try to do whatever we can.
Yeah, well, just to say thank you to you, and thank you for the report, and thank you to you and your staff for all the work you do. I mean, it can't be easy managing a budget with all the ins and outs of it, and the pressures that all the services are under, you know, so thank you very much for that.
It's okay. It's interesting, it's challenging, but it's definitely interesting, and is adds some worthiness to the job as well. Yeah,
and obviously, you know, from the report you've given now and in on previous occasions, that, you know, it's good that you you know, have that caring aspect in terms of how it impacts services as well.
Yeah, thanks very much,
So
and I'll pass all your thanks back on to the services as well.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So if we move on to the next report, which I think, Hazel, is the Forward Work Programme, isn't it?
Yes, Chair. Yes, the Forward Work Programme, you've got one more meeting before May, and we've got the MIST project coming to you on that meeting. And then it'll be for the new committees to determine their work programme going forward.
Yeah, I think looking at it, the next meeting is the 7th of April, and we've got additional learning needs and the MIST project. Is that right? On the Forward Work Programme.
You won't have the additional learning needs. I think given that we're going into pre-election period now, most of the committees have finished with their meetings. The MIST project you could consider, but I think the work on the additional learning needs would need to come back to the new administration.
All right. I mean, I was just wondering whether or not the suggestion that was made with regard to the first report about early years work. I think it was early years transformation work, and Beth Watkins. I was just wondering if that was something that could possibly be considered.
I can note it down, Chair, but I think it will be for the new committees to determine what they would like to do going forward. That's what we know.
Oh no, I was talking about the 7th of April, sorry.
It depends if the rest of the committee would like to have that at the next meeting.
Have I got any? Would you like to hear about that? Any response? I presume as I'm getting no response, then there's no objection to that. So, I mean, it's something that we could explore. Obviously, it will be up to the chair because I'm just doing this today as vice chair. Councillor Watkins.
I would have some level of concern because for some of us, campaigning on additional learning needs is part of what we will actually be doing in terms of the May elections. And therefore to have it as an agenda item and not to be able to talk about it because it will be part of what I would be talking about in terms of my campaign would actually be quite an issue from my point of view. I don't know whether other people feel the same, but I feel like there is a crossover there which would be uncomfortable from my perspective.
I agree with you, Jo.
Yeah, okay. We've got the Chief Officer here. Did you want to make a comment?
Thanks, Chair. I think I was just going to offer a view that potentially I think listening to Hazel, I think it's actually quite a long way past the start of the pre-election period, which is the 16th of March. So I think we should really consider quite carefully any of the topics have the potential to be discussed in a way that might not be conducive to that period of time. I think that's the potential risk. So maybe if the chair and Hazel liaise about that after the fact, and I'm sure we can come to a satisfactory position.
Yeah, that's fine. So at the moment, what items have we actually got on the agenda then, Hazel, for the 7th of April?
It's just the MIST project, Chair.
Just the MIST project, yeah. Okay then, that's fine. So I think we'll just move on now to the minutes. I think that's the final item. Would Councillor Powell, would you like to approve the minutes?
Yes, I'll approve the minutes, yes.
Do I have a seconder?
Yes.
Please.
Yeah, I'll second them, Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Groscut. So I think the next meeting will be on the 7th of April, and thank the officers and the members for attending. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise, for taking over in an emergency. You did very well.
Well done, Louise.
Well
Yes,
done,
well,
Louise.
Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Everybody, and look forward to seeing you at the next meeting. Bye then. And
Okay,
hopefully
bye Louise, thank you.
Councillor Thomas will be able to chair then, and wish him a speedy recovery. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.